Hi, welcome to the first edition of the Conférence pour le Brésil. Antes de começar, gostaríamos de lembrar ao nosso público que o painel com áudio ao vivo em português está disponível em nosso canal no YouTube. My name is Jacob Castle. I'm a master's student in international development and I belong to the communication team of Conférence pour le Brésil. On behalf of the organizing team, I would like to thank everyone here for attending our Brazilian economy panel. This conference is organized by Sciences Po Paris students and alumni, and its central theme is Overcoming Inequalities, 10 Years for the Sustainable Development Goals. There will be 13 panels and more than 50 speakers distributed over 7 weeks. In addition to the relentless voluntary work of our team, we thank our partners, the Setubal Foundation, Sciences Po Political Observatory of Latin America, Educalibras, and Headline for allowing us to create this free event online with simultaneous interpreting into English, Portuguese, and Brazilian Sign Language. Before we start today's panel, I would like to take this opportunity to invite everyone to attend our next meeting on November 21st at 11 a.m. Brazil time, in which we will debate the world economy. And the main theme would be lessons to overcome inequalities in an international economical environment. I would like to thank everyone, panelists and moderators who voluntarily accepted to participate in the debate and made this event possible. And now, Deborah Berlinck will be given the floor to introduce the theme of today's panel and to present our guests. Thank you very much, Jacob. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'm Deborah Berlinck. I'm a journalist, one of the Headline founders, a platform for independent journalism. So we are on social media. We invite you to be there and click and share all of our videos on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. I thank you very much for the organizers of this event, and I am especially happy to be here to moderate this debate, which is so important to all Brazilians. I am from Rio de Janeiro. I spent half of my life in Sweden and in Switzerland, and I spent most of my life in Rio, at Rocinha community, close to Rocinha community, and São Conrado, close to the social media, close to this high society of Rio, but at the same time close to the communities. As the communities show a lot of disparities. From above the hills, you see from the communities an amazing panorama and everyone's richness and everyone's opportunities that do not reach those communities. These are two opposing worlds that coexist but do not look at each other. I'm going to bring some statistics that can explain you and bring some context to this debate. Brazil is the 7th country in the world with the highest social inequality, according to a report published in 2019 by the United Nations Development Program. 10% of the richest people concentrate about 55% of this country's total income. And another important debate is that in the income distribution pyramid, the bottom 60% of the population and the top 1% were those who benefited the most from the reduction of inequalities since the year 2000. But of course, the middle class has shrunk, and this, as we're going to debate here, had political implications. I will start by presenting this highly qualified panel. First of all, Flávio Dino, he's not here with us just yet. He's the governor of Maranhão from the vice-president of the political party, now in his second term. He will undoubtedly go down in history as the communist who defeated the largest dynasty in the state, the Sarney family. Before his political career, he was a federal judge for 12 years and chaired the Association of Federal Judges in Brazil. As a member of the PCdoB, Flávio Dino was a federal deputy and president of Embratur in the government of Dilma Rousseff. The governor says fighting social inequality is one of the main challenges for his administration, and we will certainly discuss here now how he has achieved this. Mariana Almeida is another panelist. He's the superintendent of the Setubal Foundation and professor of the advanced program in public management at INSPER. She holds a PhD in development economics from the School of Economics, Administration and Accounting at USP. She developed public policies in support to small and medium businesses in the country. She has worked in several organizations, especially related to budget and planning. And she has extensively explored the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in Brazil, showing how it cruelly exposes Brazilian inequality. Marc Morgan is an Irish economist and Spanish and researcher at the World Inequality Lab at the School of Economics in Paris. He is also the coordinator of Western Europe for Western Europe at the World Inequality Database. Despite being born in Europe, Marc is a great specialist in income and wealth distribution. He's a profound scholar of Brazil's inequality and author of several reports in Brazil, some co-authored with French economist Thomas Piketty. So we'll start this debate with Marc, and I'm going to ask my question. But now I would like that, although I am not an umpire, I'm going to use 2 tickets. The green sticker will be to show that the panelists will have only 1 minute left to speak. And this one in orange just to say that the time is up. So Marc.
Argue inequality in Brazil is a political choice, a consequence of private interests who do not want to give up their share of wealth and the inaction, obviously, of several governments over decades. Why has Brazil not been able to overcome the obstacle of inequality over the years? What makes Brazil so unique, unfortunately, in this respect? Let's say in relation to other countries that were unequal in the past but managed to distribute wealth.
Thank you very much, Deborah. First of all, let me say thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation to participate in this great debate. And I would just go straight away to answering your question. I mean, the legacy of inequality in Brazil and its history, I mean, is very, very long, and we know that, and it's multifaceted, it's multidimensional. And I mean, to begin with, we know that centuries ago, Brazil was the last country, at least in the Western Hemisphere, to abolish slavery in 1888. Before going on many decades of, a long and frustrated development process that was, of course, not always equal. You've got periods of very intense industrialization in Brazil, especially after the Second World War and in the 1950s, especially, and continuing on through the 60s and 70s. But it's interesting to see, and we've done studies on the long-run evolution of inequality of income concentration in Brazil. And what you find is that it's not constant. Inequality has not evolved in a constant manner, but in a set of waves across different time periods. And we see that, for instance, what's very interesting is that after the 1940s in Brazil, we do see income concentration as measured by, say, the total income captured by the top 1% in Brazil fell quite steadily and fell quite a lot between the mid-1940s and the mid-1960s, before starting to come up again over the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. And really, it's only been really, more or less, you could say, constant since the mid-1990s. And we have a better picture of what's happening in the whole Brazilian distribution from, especially from the 1970s, when we get information from Brazilian surveys. We can measure the whole distribution. But essentially, it's the history of inequality in Brazil has been frustrated political attempts at, first of all, trying to effectively tax economic elites. So there's a fiscal history there, which is very interesting, and also at the same time, a developmentalist strategy that's obviously going to produce winners and losers. But then, how does the government compensate, for the losers in this respect? Changes in employment dynamics, globalization and liberalization tendencies from the 1980s, which devastated huge parts of Brazilian industry. The premature deindustrialization of Brazil, which happened quite fast from the late 1980s and early 1990s, I think is a very interesting dynamic. But to summarize, I would put the focus on politics and the political economy, especially what happens in Congress. We see that right at the moment where Brazilian Congress is trying to negotiate a tax reform in Brazil, which we'll see in what direction it gets taken. But I mean, the tax reform has been spoken for a long time. And, really Brazil is a country which taxes its high economic earners the least out of any emerging or developed economy in the world. And this is a problem, and a lot of Brazilian scholars have recognized this. And it's going to be interesting to see where this tax reform goes, but I'm not hugely optimistic. But since, for decades, there's been frustrated attempts at tax reform, which is equitable tax reform, which has really not come to pass. So it all happens in the political, obviously, it's a political choice, but you've got, the developmentalist industrialization side, and you've got, say, more fiscal-oriented policies, particularly tax policies, which are crucial to explain the evolution of inequality in Brazil.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Mark. You've mentioned the whole history, a brief history of inequality in Brazil. Volto a falar português.
Go back to Portuguese now. Thank you, Mark, who gave us a summary of the history of inequalities in Brazil and the difficulties Brazil has had to deal with this. And he focuses his comments on the difficulties in the political scenario and to bring changes to that. Now I'm going to pass the floor to Mariana Almeida so we can complement a little bit of what Mark has just said. The political difficulties. Mariana, you argued that the pandemic cruelly exposes Brazilian inequality, and you expose specifically differences in territorial, racial, and gender terms. You defend the creation of a great wave in favor of a change in the logic of public policies of private investment. And taking into account the current context in Brazil, with a federal government that minimizes the pandemic, that does not debate income redistribution and puts its bets on neoliberalism instead of solving development problems, the pandemic was a shock, big enough shock to bring about the change you defend so much? Thank you, Deborah, for the question. Thank you for the organizers of the conference here in Brazil. I'm very glad and honored to be here with Mark. I think there's always, we always wish for coming out of a crisis better than we enter. We don't want to come out of a crisis alone. as we were before. But no changes are natural, and no changes will be naturally coming out of the pandemics. What you mentioned about the territorial differences, uh, the TD Setubal Foundation works a lot on this specific matter of inequalities and about talking about income differences, and the population that is on the base of the pyramids, they usually are at specific locations. You mentioned in Rio, the slums on the hills, and as opposed to the middle class. And this reality presents many facets. In that area, you have lower income, less access to health, education, worse mobility, and that's a cycle that it's very hard to break. And breaking this cycle requires policies between sectors and long-term policies. I agree with Mark that to have any effect in inequalities coming from the state in terms of tax reform have to be taken ahead with other changes. There is a lot of difficulty when you try to work only one aspect. You have to have a more broad action so you can have positive effects when you have such a negative effect in terms of income inequality. So the role of the state is no doubt essential. The pandemic brought a great lesson, because despite the federal government, despite their liberal actions, they were forced by social movementation to implement the emergency allowance, which should be there, and it brought with many problems, but it got to many territories and changed the demand in the country. The demand for the market in the country went to basic needs products. Some of the centers, you don't see the normal traveling from one side to the other to go to work, and that has changed the reality. But it shows the potential you have to change these realities when you have public policies focused on these territories where you have lower income. So this is an experience we have observed, and I think we can promote. The idea you mentioned of a great pact is because the civil society, if organized, they can contribute and try to force the government to continue to act. There are some public policy mechanisms that can help. In TD Setubal Foundation, we have lawyers focusing on the territorial distribution of the budget. So the government we have a very broad legislation regarding public planning, but that is left aside in the daily decisions, and we see decisions made on a day-to-day basis. What you can change that is when you create mechanism that a new person who takes office will have to work in terms of territorial division of the budget he has. We work a lot on a city level, but I think that would work on a state level. And I think this distribution should be defined based on indicators from specific territories. And when you calculate expenses, they should be thought of thinking of these dynamics between different territories. And we should focus on changing the cycle. So I think the third sector, the civil society, can develop solutions to help in this process, but it will only reach the whole of the population with political changes. And the inequality is an agenda that will not solve in 4 years, but you can create processes that can be taken forward, especially if you create mechanisms that contribute to that. So dividing your budget intentionally, focusing on the areas that need more. So to start the conversation, I want to leave this message. Thank you, Mariana. I think you mentioned several important issues talking about this negative cycle, the need for continuous policies to change this negative inequality scenario in Brazil. And you have also mentioned some interesting examples on how the emergency allowance has changed the economy at some locations, and the fact that we cannot solve that in 4 years since the government has not the government has not been gotten here yet. Just interrupt you. The governor is here. I can see him on my screen. Hi, I'm here, Deborah. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. For some reason, I don't see you on my screen. Great. Thank you very much. So I'll make a question to the government here, and you have 8 minutes to talk a little bit about the team. In Maranhão, for almost half a century, a single family, the Sarney family, achieved almost absolute control of the state. You have Sarney as a judge, as a representative, as senators, and the family is a bit out of power, but they're still important participants in the state. They have companies, they are participants in the economy. So how do we work on bringing down this huge oligarchic groups that exist about in Maranhão, but all over Brazil? But before talking about your achievements in the government, can you mention the difficulties you had in bringing this down in Maranhão? Can you survive as a politician if you bring all this structure down? It's a pleasure to talk to all of you. It's a pleasure to be with you and with Mariana and Mark here. It's a great challenge, especially due to the national scenario in which I have this participation. I have taken office in 2015 when our recession started in our country. And since then, from 2015 on, these difficulties have only multiplied. We have challenges that are structural in nature, specifically this tax and fiscal situation. And we have some elements that are more from this recent reality. So it's very hard for a government in of a state or a city to be able to achieve, to survive alone and to transform realities in a very hostile scenario, which is what we have seen since 2015. We had the political and fiscal problems of kind of a savage fight for power, resulting in an unconstitutional impeachment in 2016. And that's caused several political disputes that resulted in two disasters. The first one, President Bolsonaro, and the second, the economic policy that he has implemented. So since then, Deborah, since I took office, I would say that my main adversary is not in my area, but in this national scenario, because I have to face heritage of universal demands for equalities. I have to urgently implement basic services in terms of health. I cannot stop multiplying beds in hospitals, opening new hospitals. We have 1,000 education works, and all that during a huge crisis in terms of finances in the States. I have to manage a huge social debt with terrible fiscal problems that are getting worse now. Be that due to what Marc mentioned or Mariana mentioned, all of the angst I feel is huge, because when you talk about the GDP, although there is an ideology there behind it, because we talk only about our gross debt, you don't talk about the net debt. But of course, the state's budget cannot be endless. But to close my first participation, in face of the pandemic and the emergency allowance and the economic recovery Brazil had been going there, the GDP, the public debt had went way up. Some want to make abrupt adjustments. Now that will be a killer. That will kill everybody. If for the budget in 2021 we comply with the something that only happens in Brazil, Mark will have difficulty to understand, is something that we don't have anywhere in the States. The federal constitution defines a limit for spending that is limited according to the inflation. It's not in the constitution, it's in our law due to some amendments. I can only increase expenses at national federal level depending on the inflation. So if the inflation is very low, we'll have no budget for tomorrow. We're in December, and we have not debated the budget for 2021 for next year yet. Bolsonaro doesn't want to debate that before the second round of our elections. So you won't have time to change the constitution, to change the upper limit, so we can debate the budget for 2021. So it's a very, very serious situation, because we don't have any fiscal or financial instruments to get out of this situation. This is the problem. I have taken over Maranhão with a very challenging situation, and with all these adverse factors, considering this emergency situation that I have mentioned.
Thank you very much for clarifying, Governor Dino, clarifying all the challenges that a governor faces considering the national scenario. I will now ask a question, and we'll get back to this topic, and the other panelists will be able to contribute to that. But I will now get back to Marc. I'm going to ask the question in English.
You've just listened what Mariana and the governor just said. You argue in favor of a progressive tax system that taxes more the richest. This is never an easy thing to do, obviously, even in rich democracies, as you know. What arguments or incentives could convince rich Brazilians to agree to pay a larger share of the burden? And I just received a question by someone who is listening to the debate, who says, how does Brazil's current tax structure perpetuate economic inequalities in the country? Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you for the question. I mean, the issue of taxing high earners, taxing high wealth in Brazil, it's a fascinating history, because unlike what we may think, at least if you go by the history of Brazil's own tax system, in previous decades, they were taxing more, at least nominally, they were taxing more high incomes. And you just have to look at the evolution of the top marginal income tax rate in Brazil, from the moment it was created in the 1920s, all the way to today. And again, you see an evolution in waves, very similar to the evolution of inequality itself. So, for example, between the 1950s and the late 1980s, you have a top marginal income tax rate of between 50% and 65% in Brazil. What's the rate today? The rate today is 27.5%, as you know. So this is a huge variation over the course of the last 50 years, 60 years. And so I think it'd be good to ask, well, how were they convinced, back then to pay such a higher rate of tax? And it was the same for developed countries and for rich countries. You get the same evolution, much higher tax rates, in the post-war period in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, than in the subsequent decades. The structural inequality in the IRPF, the income tax rate, the income tax in Brazil, the federal income tax in Brazil, is simply due to the fact that you've got different income components that are taxed at different schedules or at different rates. So beginning in the mid-90s, in Brazil, there was a push towards exempting capital income from the progressive tax system. Fixed investments, especially dividends and profit withdrawals, which were removed and taxed and were not taxed anymore. And there was a specific ideology behind that, saying, well, if they come out of the tax system, then that's going to incentivize investment, private capital investment, and the country's going to grow. But there really isn't any evidence either across time or across countries that really support that view. And in fact, we know that if we're just to look at the growth rate of the Brazilian economy across the decades, it's been strongest when these higher tax rates have been applied, similar to other countries, other developed and emerging countries. So I think, the arguments really have to do with, there's saying that there's no trade-off between inequality and growth. That when we're increasing taxes on the high earners and high wealth, we're really increasing taxes on the savings. And by doing that, we can decrease taxes on the middle class and especially on the lower classes, which taxes for them is really taxing their consumption. I'm not only talking about consumption tax, but also when you're taxing their income, it's going to hit their consumption a lot more than if you're taxing the income or the wealth for savings, waiting idle there anyway in a bank account or in the financial markets. So, really, to link the questions of distribution and development is crucial, and thinking about taxes in this way and trying to incentivize through the tax system investments, in fixed capital, investments in human training, and a demand-led thought that focuses on consumption and focuses on investment. So really, the idea that if you increase taxes on elites, they will stop working or they will invest less. It's really not borne out in the data or in the evidence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mark. Bom, muito interessante.
It is very interesting to see Mark dismantling this idea of the taxation of the elite and disincentivizing the investment. I have one question for Mariana now. Mariana, you say the public power could start considering the distribution of public resources, considering the vulnerability of the different territories. And that was very interesting. How would that work? The richest territories would accept not receiving some of the investment that could be done there? And what are the possibilities that could be emerging from that as far as political policies are concerned? I'm going to answer that, but I would just like to comment what Mark said and also regarding what the governor has said. What Mark said to me is that with maybe this will be the main driver for the economy growth. This recession we are living still, and a possible reversion of this could bring more inequality. And when inequality drops, this is an idea that something is going to improve. Good to hear this whole story, because there is this possibility. And giving this important moment and the activities that push for the development of the most vulnerable territories, there is a tendency of creating a faster pace of stimulation of production and consumption, and there is a not very explored field regarding this. But maybe Brazil is just forgetting about this GDP growth. When we are talking about the debt and the GDP, they only hear debt and they don't hear the GDP. The good indicator is that if we increase the GDP by 1 percentage point, that is good. What do I do for the GDP to grow? And this debate is just disappearing in Brazil. And this is going to incentivize the economy. What can we do to make the economy grow? This is going to fight inequality. This is going to stimulate production, and we have to give time for this country, for the country to adapt to it. And that there's also the risk of inflation. This is another debate that is always in Brazil, even though not that much in the recent years. And there are natural things that adjust themselves in the offer demand dynamics. Some of the aspects will be growing and some of them will be dropping. There is no way to react. So there are policies that debate this, and they refrain from any other debate on another aspect. If we reduce the GDP debt, we can tackle inequality. So this is one thing I wanted to mention just before I enter in the debate on the question you've asked me. We have been discussing the very restrict budget. We have a fiscal problem, and what are the effects? We have to choose. It's a matter of choice. But how do we pick and choose when we have something important on the table? The proposal we have is to create an index that is not going to operate in all of the areas, but constitutionally, there are indexes that are used for each sector, but there are pre-distributions. But there is one that is discretionary. There is a part of this that is discretionary and in which the manager decides. We can turn this into an index, and which is basically made of a population component, a structural component, and a social component that mentions mortality rate and social development. How much can each area receive from public money? When you compare and we question how people will accept this, we are not talking about refraining any area from receiving any of the resources, but we are considering different investments. But we have to go back on these choices. Otherwise, many investments would end up tackling the very same places. And in the next period, that I won't be able to change that, because the idea is that I have to be able to change this choice. This reversion that was made in some of the cities, they are trying to change that. Mexico City, for example, has worked on this in a way that they considered poverty levels. Montreal is not talking about poverty, for example, but they are talking about expenditure efficiency, and they were not distributing very equally, and they've given themselves 5 years to work out on how to be fair in this distribution. but everything is different there, and they are looking into a 5-year period in which they can adjust and change. But this is all about intention. We need to debate this explicitly, debate with society, and show that this can be done in a very transparent fashion. And this is good for the taxation system, and this is good for the way the discretionary resources are distributed. So we need to exaggerate in this construction of this mechanism so that we can bring it to debate and assess the idea and understand and commit. Whether we are under a social crisis or economical crisis, we have to see about how we can adjust and make changes. This is it. Thank you, Mariana. It is still a very difficult challenge on how to convince and what arguments to use and how to incentivize to convince the top of the pyramid and convince them into sharing part of the country's wealth and help the country. Governor Flávio, Dino, getting back to you. One of your mottos during the elections were the fight, the racial fight, and there are investments, as you have mentioned before. Uh, but the resources are still lacking with this complication and clash between the federal government and the state governments. How to manage to succeed at this in view of the very profound crisis we are living? First of all, I'd like to make one comment, Deborah, regarding what you said and what about Mariana said, and I agree with everything she said about what moral and economical stimuli we should consider so that part of the elite convinces themselves of the need for a more equalitarian country. I've been serving my country for 31 years now, and I know a bit of our history. And considering I am also a Christian, I believe in the King of Heaven and the King on earth. I would not bet everything on the conversion of the Brazilian elite, because a very expressive part of this, deep inside, will never leave the duality of master and servant. It's not only about inequality, it's about the inequality with violence and with explicit violence, because the inequality in itself is already a violence. It's an institutionalized violence. But part of the Brazilian elite is anxious because of the physical violence. I think it's all about having strength.
Having political and cultural strength and in space. As Mariana and Mark mentioned, we have to think of the Brazilian taxation system and remember that Brazil at some point had a level of 35% of income taxes in Brazil. Brazil introduced the exemption for income tax for profits very few decades ago. So throughout time, it has generated a strengthening of some classes. And if you reduce these taxes, that would strengthen agribusiness, for example. So you have a paradox between institutions and economy. Agribusiness in Brazil is the engine that moves our development. But when you look at how much tax they pay, especially the ITR, which is a tax on the territory they have. The revenues from that is insignificant. So from one side, we have to correct the taxation system, and from the other, we have to take ideology out of the economic debate, because the economic case today, you're scaring people as if you were talking about ghosts, like the ghost of inflation. Like the Minister of Economy in Brazil, he practices terrorism against his own economic policy, because he announced the increase in the exchange rate for dollars, and now he himself is denouncing hyperinflation. I have never seen that before. Usually, your Ministry of Economy is someone who is serene, who transmits security and safety for the economy and the population. In Brazil, we have the exact opposite. We have a minister that seems works like a terrorist, a mind terrorist. Let me interrupt you for a minute, Governor, because we're getting several questions, and we want to thank all the panelists, because we're doing very well in terms of time. But we are going to present you a question that was asked to Mark.
The question, someone from the public is asking you, you spoke of inequality as a set of ways that span time periods. What lasting social and political factors drive lasting forms of inequality and related economic structures?
Thank you for the question. Well, it's to answer this specific question, it goes in line with what I've said before about essentially you've got fiscal issues and more structural developmental issues that have maybe to do with past historical institutions like slavery, or really local political economy issues. So it's really a mix of factors and how the country inserts itself into the global economy, obviously. I mean, we could talk about various different types of policies, and it depends on the type of inequality you care about. If it's to do with the bottom, the middle, or the top, there's a range of policies that you can think about, at different levels of the production stage. Whether that has to do with what are called endowment policies, like education and healthcare spending, or if you talk about a universal basic income, it's also at this sort of pre-production, and it's really focused on the bottom of the distribution. You've got stuff like minimum wages, which has to do with employment and obviously formal employment. So you've got issues of informality, but that really depends on your country's economic and industrial structure. You've got all sorts of different policies that I had if I was presenting the slides, I had a nice slide on this taxonomy of policies that affect inequality. But I just wish to go back to the issue that I think was raised by Mariana, by the governor, about issues about justice and morality and development, because I think it's really important that arguments about decreasing inequality don't just rest on the issue of equity, as in morality or justice. As important as it is, I think it's really important that we talk about efficiency and improving efficiency if we improve the distribution. And this is crucial to get elites back progressive policies. And we have to show that it's also can be in their interest to support it. And I think this is key, because we can talk about morality all day and it becomes into a big philosophical debate, and it's very important. But if we really really want to have a hope of convincing those with considerable wealth, political power, it has to really do with the development and the efficiency of the economic efficiency of the country. For instance, saying, to elites, would you be willing for your income to grow a small bit, but not as much as the income of those in the middle at the bottom, in exchange for greater, investment stability, more stable aggregate demand, and essentially a growing business environment? if you've got incomes at the bottom of the middle that are growing faster than those at the top, these are the type of arguments we have to think about and show, because what's definitely negative for a development model is rent seeking, and the more your elites are dependent on rent seeking, whether from the land or from housing or from the stock market, the worse your developmental outcomes will be. So it's promoting that environment of business creation, business dynamism, but you need to have a strong aggregate demand to underpin it, and that really needs to come from the growth of incomes and opportunities of those at the bottom and the middle, or else it's not a sustainable model.
Muito obrigada, Márcio.
Mark, thank you. I think you touched on a very important point, saying that the argument has to be, I'm grossly resuming, I think if you have, the solution has to be economic. That means give up a little bit of your riches, and you have a better environment for investing. You have more stability. As you said, you have a business, an environment, an atmosphere that will make your business grow. So that's very interesting. I'm going to make a question from the public to Mariana. Mariana, how can you have a budget and a taxation that is fairer under a limit on your expenses? This is a $1 million question. That's what I was going to say. This limit to the spendings that Governor Dino mentioned a little bit, it creates a kind of rigidity in the structure, because if you say that you're going to grow according to inflation, means to say that you're not going in an actual real manner. You won't have actual growth. So you remove the possibility of an actual growth as a part of the redistribution of the growth of the nation as a whole. So if we grow, it won't be redistributed, it won't enforce the public policies. So we have a contradiction. It's a way of stop debating real growth, actual growth in Brazil, and talk more deeply on public policies. So you keep this game, so every time you mention something, they come and say that's impossible, we can do that, we have an impeachment, and so on and so forth, and you create all this panic with the population. So I think it's the opposite. You really have to fact structural changes in our tax structure, associate this to the logic of distribution. It's important to say that there are some public expenses that can be better employed. We don't want to say that the government should go on spending as they are spending without any direction. You need a direction, and we need to bring this to a public debate. Let's have a tax reform, but associate that to indicators and to results. Where am I going to send this revenues that additional revenues that I get? So if you're talking about basic income and some kind of income transfer that brings more economic power to the bottom of the pyramid, we had something in the past, but this has changed. We have a pandemic, and we're still debating if that's feasible or not. So we have to take this opportunity to associate this financing to this change in the taxation system. It's important, increasing, for example, the taxation over the richer of the company, and then the country, and direct these revenues to where we need it. Another argument to convince them, I don't think we have to convince only the richer layer, but we have to destroy this narrative in the country, especially when you talk about the middle class, the upper, lower, and middle class. And when we are talking about entering the economy. So we're not talking about equality. We have to talk about that. You have to talk to use the reality in your conversation, in your arguments. It's not a socialist debate. It's an economical debate. If you think of that, you grow and you have a more robust economy. And there is a layer of the society that can be convinced of that. And that would help put pressure on over the other areas, especially the elites uh, who might not be convinced, but they might be pressured. And if you have a broader environment, a broader population that is convinced, you have more possibilities in terms of justice, but also efficiency and possibilities for growth. Thank you, Mariana. We need great communication work when we're talking about reducing inequalities, especially in convincing those who refuse to support reforms that might, at the end of the day, bring improvements to their own situation. I have a question from the public to Governor Flávio Dino. We talk a lot about reforms, about changing the country. Mark talked about efficiency, Mariana too. The federal government under Paulo Guedes and the reforms he is suggesting, will it reduce inequalities in Brazil? He don't even talks about inequalities. His dictionary doesn't contemplate some words. Inequality is one of them. Poverty is another one. Economic growth is another one. These are terms he is not acquainted with. So he'll hold on to his beliefs that have nothing to do with the reality. And I was debating with him, and he said the left wing won't accept this or that. And I told him, your problem is not with the left wing. Your problem is reality. The reality we have is a minimum government and minimal and the government situation, especially the pandemic, when you have this terrible sanitation crisis and all the social problems we have.
EBGA disclosed some information. Brazil increased 0.8. And it's the fourth year we have the best numbers of job generations in our state. We need to revisit this discourse. We need to see about public fund. We have to see if FAT has money, if GTS, if GTS has money. We are talking about a lot of money that is available. We don't need to use the international reserves for anything. We need to leverage processes of growth. It is an equation, as Mariana said. You need to prevent ourselves from having useless expenditures. It is just too simple to say this, but the probability of using public money is important to be fair and just. We need the public resources. The corruption is never in favor of the poor. It is never in favor of those who need a social policy. It is in favor of those who are already privileged. So we need to put measurements in place and convince and win. We have to defeat the elite in this aspect of thought. And this means that economically and morally they have to be convinced. And this is what we have to do. We have to start now this year and then bring it to a more structured dimension further on. Thank you, Governor. It is incredible. We are right on schedule. We still have 15 minutes to close this panel and to include your final considerations. So I'll kindly ask you to think of these final considerations and consider this question. Let's suppose all the public policies that are required in Brazil to revert the situation were applied. The question is, with the 7th most unequal country in the world, how long do you think it would take for us to overcome and revert the situation we have in Brazil? Let's start by listening to Marc Morgan.
Yes, because I didn't have the simultaneous translation. Would you be able to repeat the question in English, please? I think I only got a slight.
Supposing all the right policies are put in place, okay, in Brazil, given the fact that Brazil is so unequal, it's on the top of the ranking in the world, how long would it take? How many generations would it take for Brazil to be a much more equal country?
Well, I mean, there's.
I know it's a tough question.
I mean, there's many types of inequality already to begin with. You can even look at the inequality between men and women in Brazil, the gender inequality dimension, which could, I mean, current trends could take, up to, the end of this century to get parity, the same amount of proportion of women at the top in Brazil than men. There's very different angles in inequality that you can look at to answer this question. But on the economic inequality of income and wealth, I mean, it's very hard to answer. We could be talking at generations or decades to get to much lower levels of inequality. And I mean, it depends what thresholds we have in mind, what benchmarks do we have in mind? Are we talking about the levels of inequality that were experienced in Western Europe, Japan and the United States, in the 30 years of the Second World War? I mean, if that's the case, then Brazil does have a long way to go in terms of those levels. And if you want to get there in a relatively short space of time, you're going to have to enact quite radical policies, especially tax policies on income and wealth, and other macro public policies. So I think if we focus on the short term, and we've got this COVID recession among us, and I think the crucial aspect here, it was touched upon, the limitations on spending, the techo de gastos. I mean, this really needs to be challenged and abandoned seriously. It's especially to overcome this recession, because spending must take the lead, and larger deficits are by definition going to have to be put in place if the economy wants to recover, and taxes will follow later. I think, and just to finish on 2 points, the main issues going forward, which have to do with inequality and getting over this crisis. Already before COVID, Brazil had a high structural unemployment level of over 12%, very high informality, between 30 and 40%, depending on the estimation. So there are two key issues that really need addressing, which would also address distribution, of course, because these are distributional, these are distributional variables in themselves. So, I mean, getting just those two addressed, unemployment and informality, already, you would go a long way.
Thank you very much, Marc. Mariana?
Mariana, if you could please make your final considerations and answering my question or not, or commenting on what Marc said. Okay. I will use the challenge in answering how long it will take for us to overcome the inequality. I think it's hard to define, of course. It depends on how far you want to go, but the longer we take to make any changes, the longer it will take for us to achieve our goal. So we see the inequality increase, and it's harder and harder to revert this. Unemployment generates inequality, and it's growing, and it brings lack of hope to the population because they stop seeing what is ahead for them. It brings insecurity. They see that they are not going to grow. We are not going to have any other alternative, and it generates insecurity, and it makes it harder for them to see what's going to happen. When we talk about correct public policies, society and economy are dynamic. The public policy generates incentives, but then it moves reality on all the agents in society, and they have to be alive and acting as a very positive driver. You cannot just remove one resource from one group and then allocate it to another. We need to have correct public policies instead of transferring resources from one group to another. We need to compensate that, and we have to ensure education, safety, mobility, so that people can develop and then enter a positive cycle of development that can be personal, and it's going to reflect into society, and we have to keep this alive and bring this to society. So the more you flatten the capacity of the people to develop themselves, the harder it is for you to rescue that person back in the game. So I think this is a process that is going to be taking decades to change, and it's going to be harder and harder if we take too long to make any changes, because we're going to kill the main active people, which is the society. Mariana, thank you very much. Now we have Governor Flávio Dino for his final considerations. I would like to thank for the kind invitation from everyone who has organized this event and those who are watching us, and also thank you for the opportunity of learning with Mariana and Deborah and Marc. Of course, it's hard to set a date, and that would be something like a philosopher's stone. But there's one thing that there is for sure. The harder you take to start, if you are on the wrong track, it's hard for you to get back to the correct track if you don't realize you are on the wrong track. It brings the theme of social justice and challenges as a way to the development, a vector of development. It's not about just ethics. Of course, ethics are in place, are on the table, and moral is on the table, and philosophy. But of course, it is an economical and, of course, political matter, because every economy is political. We need to correct the path in Brazil and talk about the industries and value the green economy, the solidarity in economy. And we have to verify the role of banks and the state. And the state is not only a regulator, it also has the mission of intervention. As you know, in Article 170 of the Constitution, this is ensured. And of course, we need to look at the elite taxation, because of course there's not only one answer, but this is one possible answer, and I believe this is essential. And this is the only taxation in the Constitution that is not fulfilled to date. And from the Treasury point of view and justice, at least from that point of view, this would be great if we could have that fulfilled and actually in place. And this would help with the pandemic's expenditures we're having. So we thank you very much. And I hope we can turn this debate into something that moves the population to make a fairer and sovereign country. Thank you very much, Governor. I hope one day we can see another politician that can adopt a motto for the campaign that says, we are going to tax the elite. It was a pleasure to be the moderator of this panel that is just so interesting with great panelists. Mariana Almeida, Governor Flávio Dino, and Marc Morgan. I would also like to thank Pour le Brésil for this very fantastic initiative. And I would like to thank in special everyone who is watching us just now. Have a very good day, good afternoon, and good evening. And I will see you then.